Hello, and thanks for joining today. My name is Davi Ottenheimer. I'm the VP of Trust and Digital Ethics at Inrupt, and I'm going to talk today about the top 7 AI breaches, which is really learning to protect against unsafe learning. A bit of tongue-in-cheek there, but you'll see in a minute how what we're talking about today is what should have happened with AI, what was expected, and then what actually was delivered. And then we'll dive in a little deeper into examples of where things go wrong so you understand essentially why we have these breaches of trust in artificial intelligence systems. I have to give a trigger warning. Unfortunately, a lot of the material we talk about today is disturbing or upsetting to people because the nature of the intelligence that we're talking about can be very upsetting. And so with that, let's jump in. First, I want to give you a couple quick stories to set the context. The first story is the Tatra 87, which a lot of people apparently don't know about. Maybe people in the car cultures do, but this is a very famous car in the sense that it was way ahead of its time. It was a very interesting concept in how fast it went and how good it was, mile per gallon efficiencies and so forth. But when the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia, they basically stole the design. You may recognize it from the Porsche or the Volkswagen, which is basically where the Germans got the idea from. But also it killed more Nazi generals than World War II itself. And the Czechs ultimately called it their secret weapon because so many Germans were killing themselves with this technology. And so it's important to keep in mind that when people say they want to rush into new technology and they want to get a hold of the latest, greatest because it has so many features and benefits, it may end up actually doing more harm to themselves than good. And in this case, that actually is an interesting use case because of the competition or the competitive nature of what's going on with technology. Often you think you're going to be the good guys and do the great things, but you'll ultimately end up preventing yourself. They actually ended up banning the generals. The Nazis had to ban people from driving the car because they were so bad at it. But the second example, or the second story, really takes that even further to say that in 1977, there was this theory of John McCarthy, who some people say is the father of AI or one of the fathers. And the 0.3 theory, as I call it, is when he said you want 1.7 Einsteins and 0.3 of the Manhattan Project. And he says you want the Einsteins first, but he also has a caveat that it can take up to 500 years. So who knows where we are in the spectrum of time, but you definitely know that what you want is something that is more collaborative than it is competitive. Back to my first story. So if you have collaboration, the more natural state, then you can actually see if you're on the team as other people, we're all humans, we're working together, then we get a lot of benefits out of AI. But if you're in a competitive state and you're actually trying to build nuclear weapons and kill each other, then you get into a very bad state, in the competitive state of the Nazis trying to destroy the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, right? It causes a lot of harm when people get ahead of themselves in terms of technology, where they're going to go with this stuff. So, and I find this to be true more and more across science. The more I study all of the examples in intelligence, all the uses of AI, I find that there's collaboration versus competition, and more collaboration usually leads to better outcomes. Wherever it's used for competition or competitive purposes, it leads to pretty sad outcomes. So in modern context, 1977's 0.3 theory, AI should prevent harm. And when you look at the Afrofeminist concerns about data use, this actually comes up quite a bit in Africa when you look at all the places that data is being collected and how it's being used and what it should be used for and how AI integrates with that, right? You want a 1.7 approach to this as opposed to a 0.3 approach to this, if that makes sense. And even more so when you talk about, AI should stop catastrophe or catastrophic events for humanity and human rights law. NATO is talking about how to use AI and where AI is ethical, where it should be used, and what a breach would look like. Again, think collaboration versus competition. And NATO is by nature, it's defined by essentially being a militarized competition. It's trying to protect some states against other states. So it's in a very interesting and dangerous space. So from there, I just want to point out that in 2016, I made an RSA conference talk where I basically laid out Facebook as a doomsday machine. And I've seen this topic come up more and more. The Atlantic even wrote up an article that was very good about Facebook being a doomsday machine in 2020. And they talked about how every situation they found extremist violence, they found Facebook there as well. More and more evidence that the actual AI algorithms and the platforms are doing things that ultimately cause tons of harm. And I would say this is not that different from a doomsday machine. So you find that AI from the 1930s to today is at risk of being that actual horrible thing that's going to bring the end of the world. And so we really have to think carefully about what these breaches mean very circumspectly, as opposed to in a narrow sense, are we winning this competition or that, but more like, are we doing good in the 1.7 sense, or are we precipitously going to end up in the 0.3 sense launching a nuclear weapon that we would not want to, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis event, which is what I talked about in 2016. So today, what I want to talk about is first, what should be expected of AI? And I give this in 3 different sections: incompleteness, imitation, and efficiency. The first one might sound a little harsh, but until we get into it, you'll see that incompleteness really is from 1929. Gödel very famously said that in any consistent axiomatic mathematical system, propositions that can't be proved or disproved. And what he's saying, that you don't want to read the German, it's even harder to understand. But in English, the translation really is that a computer can't answer all the questions itself to achieve its objectives. It needs some external influence. It needs some oversight. It needs some external inherited sources. And another way somebody's put this to me recently is intelligence is the spice in the soup. It's not the soup itself. So you need to have a perspective on this, that it is incomplete by definition. And the second is that when you take simple thoughts and try to make them into binary circuits, as in 1937, you see there's evidence of this from Shannon, who's credited with basically birthing the computer industry. You have A equals Z, Z equals A, simple logic. And if you say Bob bought X toothpaste, therefore he'll buy a toothbrush, this is not the same as human reasoning, where you say a cloud leads to rain. You can't say a rain leads to cloud. Violence leads to pain. You can't say pain leads to violence necessarily. So in logic and in the way that we represent the completeness of the human mind in the way that it works, we have an incompleteness situation with the computers. The second point is that the imitation game, or the way that it's been framed around Alan Turing, in 1950, he's basically saying, computers can imitate the human, and it's a game to try to figure out if you're talking to a machine or a human. And I do want to point out here that Turing was essentially persecuted for his beliefs or his choices, and so he was actually killed by his own country very unceremoniously, and he was led to his own death. But that is fascinating when you think about how we need to respect people's difference of opinions today. And so we base, a lot of our AI and a lot of the imitation and a lot of the ideas around right and wrong, and AI will figure out what's good and bad, on a person who was essentially persecuted for who he was. And you see in the 50s rapid advancement of machines and AI. The term is coined, and the IBM comes out with a machine, the Perceptron, that's supposed to recognize right from left, may as well have been right from wrong, right? And so you get very quickly this sort of excitement. And from there, in 1958, towards the end of that period, you find the Navy in the United States saying, hey, we can recognize people, we can instantly translate speech, things are going to be amazing. Here's 1958, you see a robot being developed that has very human attributes, looks very much like it's going to turn into this thing that's going to replace humans. And actually from there, you even see in 1964, the idea that you have to have, recognition in systems like anti-aircraft systems or long-range missiles or, artillery. And that very naturally translates into people thinking, well, if we can do facial recognition, then on a micro level, we can do all sorts of things to protect ourselves from harms as well. It's a very old concept. And I don't think a lot of people realize that it was 1966 even when people were talking about license plate recognition, where tapes were being recorded and sent to a mainframe. And this was $1.4 million equivalent in today's terms in New York State, that was used on bridges to try to figure out, who's driving and who's driving out, try to find criminals. So a lot of the stuff that was promised, out of these ideas of efficiency suddenly came in 1979 to sort of a screeching halt when people said, wait a minute, the efficiency around this, the fairness of this, by ceding agency to machines, given the incompleteness, given the imitation, by ceding this, you end up in efficiency running into something else, which is racism. And so that really, I think, set people back. So let me get to the next section here, which is good segue, what has been delivered by AI. In fact, what's been delivered by AI has been not just incompleteness, not just, oh, you need a helping hand here to figure out what's going on, but total gibberish. And what's been delivered in terms of imitation has been basically fraud. And then finally, Breaking Bad, another presentation I gave at RSA conference in the past. The efficiency has led to serious breaks in the trust relationship. So first, incompleteness, very simply, as Shannon told us in 1937, you have this ability to say marijuana causes cancer. You can translate that, but flip it around, cancer causes marijuana. The machine can't tell. They absolutely can't tell when words are shuffled around, to the point where if you take an actual oppositional model of very complex ideas in the human world, the machine has absolutely no idea how to deal with it. So GPT is essentially useless when you talk about incompleteness. And so when you talk about imitation, interestingly, you find that there's a lot of fraud, deep fakes, and some of that is, I think, fascinating in terms of power struggle, because you think about white men who have to listen to non-white men. It's actually a scary proposition. So I think a lot of people saying, oh my God, what if Tom Cruise is faked, are really saying, what if someone else who's not Tom Cruise has that voice and can talk to me as though they are Tom Cruise? That's a much deeper problem than it is just the fact that someone looks like someone else. White men fear loss of control, essentially. And so they lose a lot of the privilege that they had of being white men. And so more importantly, I think we see a lot of the machines are actually failing at a very severe level. They're actually killing people. Human learning machines are not doing this, and they're getting held at a much higher consequence level. A literal child was picking a flower and was basically taken to court over it at a bus stop, whereas a car that's learning, not even at a child level, can run over people and kill them and not be held responsible at all. And so Two very interesting cases of imitation. And the third in the efficiency, what we've seen in factories in terms of the efficiency and the dangers of it is that things get much worse with robots. We see a lot of death. We see a lot of injuries. We actually see it worse to work with robots than without. And you see the optimization or freedom basically squeezing people to the point where we're seeing a repeat of what we saw in 1906, which was hugely unsafe factories and unsafe working conditions. Particularly Amazon was called out for this several times. And so if you just want to look at the whole history of efficiency with robots, you see that there's a lot of deaths, across the spectrum, but they've been happening more and more recently. In fact, if you look at the Tesla quarter by quarter accidents, it's been increasing dramatically versus relative to all the other vehicles on the road. They're more than anyone seem to have more and more accidents per mile when you do the simple math. All right, so where things go wrong, you've seen, we're supposed to be seeing, the promises. You saw basically what happened, and so that's bad. And so now let's talk about where things go wrong. And let me give a caveat there that there's a book about surveillance capitalism, which I believe to be dangerously wrong, because surveillance, when you think about it, is watching over supervision. It's basically this idea of being a parent, if you will. The supervision, surveillance, very similar concepts. You surveil things as a scientist. Capitalism is the idea of you have competition, de-emphasizing collaboration. Very dangerous, but I'm not going to say you can't compete. Of course, competition has a place in the world. So you don't want to get rid of competition, and you don't want to get rid of surveillance, really. Be like saying you want to get rid of science. And that's really bad, because authorized knowledge and fair play and ownership are fundamental to our scientific systems. And so you should think instead perhaps about the harms from debt capitalism. That's really the problem, where people are put into a situation they can't get out of. So they're indebted, their consent is violated, there's excessive knowledge they didn't approve, there's exploitation of them, they're controlled in a way that they can't get out, and they can't leave the pitch that they're on, that they're playing the game they don't want to play. They're in competition when they don't want to be in competition. Like being a slave and told you have to compete with the others if you want to eat food, as opposed to, hey, I don't want to have to compete for my food like this. It's just a ridiculous context people. So it's not surveillance capitalism any more than I would say that slavery was about surveillance. It's much more about debt, and it's about debt capitalism that we should be talking. So if you criticize things too much with the surveillance capitalism, I believe you get into mysticism, because you're basically going back to really simple observations unless you have the power of surveillance and unless you have the power of competition. And so I would illustrate this very simply as if you're in a binary world, things are very easy, routine, minimal judgment. You get rid of all the surveillance, you get rid of all the overseeing and supervision, but you lose all the knowledge that's necessary for essentially advancement. And if I put it back in, here you can see politicians exist in a ranked world, contrarians exist in a heat map world, critics who are essential to good science and essential to good social advancement. You need your critics who use absolute ranking. Well, they would cease to exist essentially if you get rid of all those abilities to talk about, to surveil and to compete. And then philosophers, of course, one of the highest orders, I believe, of thought. So narrow-mindedness basically becomes accepting what is versus what should be. And that's what we have to be careful about. We need to have that information. We need to gather that information. We need to look at that information as humans in order to figure out where we want to be, as opposed to just collecting things very minimally and not understanding it and saying, well, this is what's been in the past, so this is what's going to be in the future. The fundamental building blocks of the United States, for example, are white supremacy and misogyny. And we don't want that to be the future. We want to change that. And so the future shouldn't just resemble the past. It's in conflict with our moral values. We should make sure that we change the future based on our past, right? So we can't just accept things as they are the way that machines do. And what makes intelligent humans so dangerous is, for example, con games, where you narrow down the games that you play to a point where people are successful because they've defined away all of the things that would hold them responsible, the consequences of their actions. Edison, for example, would take other people's inventions, but somehow we'd label him a genius at inventions. It's just not true. Appropriated other people's ideas. And the more you do research on him, the more you realize what an inhumane, horrible person he was. And America's civil rights struggle, its racist history, makes it especially vulnerable to AI risks, because if you allow people like Edison to be given credit, for things being called intelligent, then you're allowing machines that are as bad or worse than Edison to also be given credit for doing terrible things. And so you get dangers increasing through tech domain shifts, where basically repeating rifles become the effective, the example of, or machine guns even become an effective example of technology that shifts the entire domain. And in digital slavery, that kind of very dangerous shift from one domain to the other is the new form of this technology that can seriously upend and change the way that power is balanced. So we're really talking about power more than anything else when we talk about AI breaches and risks to people. So let me put it in terms of real AI or intelligent machine games. where they game specifications the same way an Edison would, or a colonialist would, or someone who wants to do harm. So what you see, for example, is my favorite example ever, really, was you want to make machines flip pancakes, and they get penalized if they drop them on the floor. So they start flipping them so high they never land. Nobody eats, everyone starves to death, but it's okay because they're winning because the pancakes aren't touching the floor. And they do this sort of gamification because they find loopholes, essentially. And this is true in human world too. Russia, for example, was trying to bombard foreign athletes to where they would quit by just hitting them with lots of information that would disrupt their thinking and disrupt their ability to perform. People were giving up in the same way that AI was winning a tic-tac-toe game, for what it's worth. So it figured out that if it did infinite moves that exhausted the opponent, they couldn't figure out where on the board, because it was an infinite-sized board. If they couldn't figure out on the board where the next move was, they would just give up. And that's how tic-tac-toe was being won by AI. So I think a lot of these things are useful to understand because, like I said, AI power abuse is really about civil rights. And what it comes down to is that things are changing because of the domain shift and the way that AI is being used. And so these breaks are especially important to understand if you really want to prevent harm at the massive levels. And so if you want to ask yourself, what can I do about this? Wow, this is really going to get bad really fast. You obviously don't want a nuclear explosion. You obviously don't want catastrophic harms. You don't want racism. You don't want all these horrible things. Well, you need to figure out not just how do you fix these algorithms, very common question. And you need to not just figure out how does the algorithm interact with society at large? Is it doing bad things? Is it flipping pancakes and starving people by throwing them too high? But you need to figure out how you interact with society at large and where you get authority from when you add your completeness to the incompleteness of AI. So what is the background of the people who are working on this stuff, and where did they make their assumptions is a much deeper issue. So let's find AI first of all. Where is this happening? And ultimately, I'd have to say it's like software, it's everywhere. When I got into security, basically it was everywhere because everyone used hardware and software. The same as in AI. I find that everywhere I find data, everywhere I find interfaces to data, someone's trying to slap on some AI or use some sort of artificial intelligence, machine learning of some kind. So expect it to be everywhere. And that's really, when you get down to it, that's pretty much it. Second, you want to test it. Again, like when I got started in security, you got to jump in and start testing everything everywhere and find where things are broken. So find vulnerabilities in every process you can find in AI. It's actually quite fun, and there's a lot of work to be done. So for example, you can use a strategic checklist. You can have a test plan where you say, let's look for the fairness, the impact, and the transparency. This is different because it used to be just looking at consequences primarily. I feel like now you have to look at the motives of the people who are in the game. And so fairness or inherited rights, this incompleteness theory, allowing people to figure out where the rights are coming from outside, really helps frame the competitions. And if you look at this Daytona 500 quote by Darrell Waltrip, it helps let you know that, everyone's cheating all the time, anytime you have any kind of competition. So really look for the people who are trying to use that to their advantage using this sort of fit model. But if you look for fairness, impact, and transparency, I think you're on your way to testing effectively using a simple checklist. And so what would that look like? You can do the fit of data. You can do the fit of the objectives. You can look at the assessment team itself, the blue team, red team. You can look at the process. You can look at the operational oversight, or a board, if you will. A lot of people have to have a review board if they're going to use AI, because without it, just like without having auditing, how would you know that the books aren't cooked? And so you ultimately don't want to become the authority the way a referee in Russia might be, beating up the players. You want to be a person who allows people to play so that they can ultimately be competitive in a collaborative way, if that makes sense. So let's go on. Regulation fundamentally is pretty worthless without tests. You can't enforce things unless you can prove things are wrong. So this is more and more an essential aspect of learning. Intelligence, artificial intelligence is not going to be successful unless people are able to go in and test and prove that it's breaking. And if you want to apply and make enforceable engineering actions for safe learning, you can do things tactically, or you tell engineering, for example, that in an easy, routine, minimal judgment world, for example, you don't know much about what's going on, but there needs to be an off button and there needs to be a reset button. These are fundamentals, right? If the machine isn't working, in the case of a car not driving the right way, you hit the brake, it turns it off, or you take control back. A reset button says, erase all those decisions you made, you learned wrong. How do you recorrect or change the things that it had learned because it learned them in the wrong way? And you don't want to be penalized for that. Strategic is much bigger, right? You have an ethics review board, as I started to allude to already. You start to threat model and figure out how to identify going forward where things are going to be risky or where they're going to cause problems. And you start to gate releases through all these tests and audits. So you set up process and procedures. And then ultimately, you have to have some executive level enforcement. You got to have the ability to drop the hammer on stuff that's broken. And so let me just make a big, very important caveat there. When you start to do these tests, they may be very unpopular, just like security always runs into these problems with some executives. And so Amazon in particular said they do not like tests being run because they're inconsistent with how something's supposed to be used. Yeah, Duh. That's the whole point. If I can do things that are inconsistent with how this is designed to be used, you got a problem. And so you got to sometimes educate places like Amazon about what the right way to fix things is. So let's jump into the top 7 AI breaches. And we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to blow through these pretty fast, but I think they'll give you a taste of what's out there. And there's actually a really great report that just came out from Adversa AI, which says, they think there's vision, analytics, language, and autonomy, 4 categories. I went with 7 categories, so I'm going to dive a little deeper. But fundamentally, you can see that there's targeting based on, how, at least from their perspective, how things are being used. I would actually say that their targeting percentages come a lot from what they see in the industry, not from where we're going to see things going. So I biased mine towards where I think things are going to go as opposed to just what we've been seeing. 1, translation. Translation is an interesting one because, as you remember, in the beginning, in the 1950s and 1960s, it was supposed to be done instantaneously and quickly replacing people who did translation. In fact, what we're finding is a lot of interesting cases where it's totally broken. And here's just a simple example. In Hungarian predictive gender, if you try to add an O as you write program, the word programmer in English would be equivalent, it flips the gender of the sentence. So she's an amazing programmer, he's an amazing programmer. And so you got to ask, well, why? Why is he suddenly showing up? What's that prediction coming from? So let's dive a little deeper. In Finnish, you can see that this Pekka, which is a male name, suddenly becomes different if you put some emotion in there. Loves cars, Pekka loves cars. He, and then on changes to female, and then it changes again to angry, it goes back to he. So I could go on and on about these. There's so many examples. For example, if I put beautiful and sexy, it flips a gender from he to she, right? The word beautiful forces female override. So you can sort of predictably figure out where you want, genders to be. And these obviously have effect on people if they read something and how it's translated. The he, she gender is very important in terms of people's perception of self. So car is gendered, for example, except when you add love, it becomes she. Genders are inverted. I started off with he, she, right, back and forth, but then it flips over to he, she, he. So you can see that's related to work. In some languages, of course, they try to warn you by giving you some sense here that Persian and Turkish have a gender warning that say basically he, she, gender neutral, but that even breaks. I can flip it back and forth and the he's and she's disappear. And fairly reliably too. I can predict basically what gender I'm going to get based out of the algorithm. So she, he ends up being she, and here you can see Persian flip back and forth. All right, so obviously translation's breaking in a lot of different ways. I've done this for a lot of years, and it seems to be getting better in some ways, but mainly worse because more and more people are recognizing that it's a problem and wondering, should they even use the translation if they can't trust it? So 2, let's talk about written speech. Now, this is interesting because what you find is that there's a lot of bad language on the internet, of course. And so a lot of machines are supposed to be dealing with this. Chatbots in particular are supposed to be protecting you against this sort of thing. But instead, what you find is the Korean chatbot in this example starts to sort of spread back to the example of Alan Turing, right? 1950 and 54, 58, see these advances, and people are talking about how sensitive it is and important it is that we remember his life and his role. Well, here you can see that verbally abusive language is targeting LGBTQ groups, particular groups consistently being targeted. And that's right away. It's not like they came out of this and it happened over time. It's like right out of the box, these things are being discovered. Here's another one from Google where you can see that I am a gay Black woman is 87% toxic. But if you start spewing white supremacist narratives, not seen as toxic. Another problem. That's just not right, the way that it's being interpreted. And so here's another one where the Amazon staff were targeting lesbian and gay literature disproportionately. They said, oh, it's a software glitch, but that didn't seem to be a reliable explanation for the problem. They accidentally were censoring all the gay literature off of their site using a software glitch. And then here's another example where Facebook was amplifying hate, 10 billion false views, false and toxic content being spread by not releasing the algorithms they had that supposedly were capable of getting rid of this. And we're talking about like Facebook being 75% of online hate and harassment, far beyond any other platform. Far, 75% of those who were harassed said it was happening on Facebook, the way I should say that, but far, far beyond any other platform, just in their own league of allowing horrible, toxic content, even though they say they have algorithms that can work on this. So 3, let's talk about emotion, really health recognition. And this is a fascinating space. I went through some examples myself where I found this has been the same for years. I can basically fool any system into thinking whatever I want my emotion is. So I could make it sad, 99%, happy, 98%. I had neither of those emotions when I was doing this. Years ago, I gave a presentation where I talked about I could take data from World Wrestling Federation, I think, or WWE, and I could basically show that the guy on the bottom who's being choked and stomped on has 91% happiness, 92% happiness, which is ridiculous. And this is important because when you think about drones flying around now that are doing emotional analysis of huge crowds or even just sensors in large crowded spaces, they're going to be assessing everyone's emotions and reporting what they think the state of a crowd is, which is going to lead to some response. And even targeting based on those emotions, right? Find all the happy people, take out all the angry people, respond because somebody's going to be in a fight. I've worked with a lot of this stuff in like individual cases. Like if you have a sensor that turns on and says, hey, look at this spot, a fight's about to brew because we hear anger. That's something people have to rely on, and they're going to respond to that, maybe even with force. So another part of health is, of course, using these diagnostics to try to improve people's lives. We find that clinical systems are fundamentally flawed, again, because of bias. So they'll be reporting things in ways that are such, high risk of bias that you can't even use them. They're so flawed. The underlying biases are so poorly understood that you can't rely on this for healthcare. All right, 4. So gender classification, again, you can see these are themes that are sort of intertwined, repeating themselves a little bit. But if you took a picture like this and you fed it through some of these algorithms and you said, okay, fine, is this male or female? It's fundamentally the wrong question. Even though computers are ranking the way people look, they do things in a way that don't make a lot of sense because binary classifications erase people. Here's an algorithm that I was talking to people about. They were developing this that was just determining gender from behind, from the back of a head. And it's had man, women counted, but it didn't have a non-binary. And if it did, it assumed it wasn't done yet, as opposed to just saying, okay, this is a non-binary, a gray space, right? So you really want to stop erasing people and allowing them to live in a non-binary space if that's what they actually are. That's more fundamentally respectful of the human. And it's an authorization question. Who's giving you the authorization to define them in a way that they wouldn't define themselves? So very important to understand in these classifications and gender. But you get into it a little bit further. You can see Amazon, for example, was training its AI recruitment tool on men only, basically. So it taught itself that only male candidates were preferable. It actually penalized anyone who was recognized as a woman. Anytime they showed up as a woman, it was binary. Boom, you're less desirable to us. And so that's a problem if they're trying to be a fair hiring company. And so if you look at Facebook versus LinkedIn, this is a very interesting study. They found that a huge difference. They found that Facebook was biasing software engineer ads, for example. Lots of ads they tested, lots of ads were biased. And so here's just one example where they said, 63% of men were being shown this ad, 36% of females or women were shown this ad. And LinkedIn, it was basically an equitable distribution. In fact, it was almost the opposite. You had more women seeing the ad than men. And so it was beyond what could be legally justified, which means they're breaking the law. And so this sort of algorithm that's supposed to be fair and be more efficient and impersonate or ends up being so incomplete as to be completely broken, illegally broken. So let's talk about 5, visual facial recognition. Here's an interesting one, because I think what people often don't understand is that even in the human world, this is a really big problem. So machines being able to do it is almost impossible. I think the idea that or recognizing that the problem is so great that they can do a very small subset is the first step to understanding it. So go ahead, write down what you see here. I'll wait for a second as you write down the word that you think this image represents, or words. And so I ran it through the algorithms to see what it would come up with. And here you can see that it thinks it's a military dot reticle, or a sight, for shooting things. Okay, so I'm looking at a gun sight. That's definitely dangerous feedback. So I edited out a little bit of the white space. Let's just crop that image size down a little bit. Boom, it's a happy, smiley, fun game that, maybe it's a kid that, is playing with a star and has a smiley face. So reduced space completely changes the sentiment here and completely changes the recognition of what we're dealing with, which, tongue in cheek, you can see things change dramatically based on what sort of assumptions are being made. And all I did was change white space. I made it a square instead of a rectangle. Nothing else changed. So in reality, this is an actual test, and it's given to humans, and it's a smart test to give people, because what you're looking at is a submarine porthole with a fishtail, or whatever you want it to be, but it's never usually what people think it is. And so what does that look like in real AI terms again? Well, you can find that Twitter was auto-cropping AI. So it was supposedly finding faces, but in fact, it wasn't finding black faces. It was only finding white faces, unless you flipped, the contrast or messed with the grayscale, and then it would find them. So very interesting the way it was being triggered. And so you can see here also that when you do some grayscale adjustments on the image on the right, it turns out the person looks black instead of white. And so the ACLU filed a lawsuit based on the false arrest of blacks based on these crazy recognition systems where the computers completely get wrong who they're looking at. And then when the people appeal and say, well, this is an incomplete assessment, the people have even more. They double down. The police double down and say, well, you should trust technology even more. You should go Google it to get an answer from a computer instead of really talking to us about what the problem is. A school exam, for example, tried to recognize faces in order to reduce fraud and cheating in the schoolroom or to validate tests, and it basically just stopped seeing black faces. That's obviously a disaster. And Google even was so sensitive about its own racism that it started blocking searches. So it actually took people out of, or took all the searches out that it thought would reveal the fact that it was being racist. Uber terminated workers it couldn't see, again, trying to validate people in order to use the system, and the system couldn't see them, and so it actually terminated them unfairly. And so let's talk about the threat detection now, because you can see all the problems with language and written language and spoken language and facial detection and emotional detection. So what happens if you try to figure out who's a threat to you? Well, trust me, in this example is a very fun paper. You know, if a boat's coming to attack or a train's coming to attack, you can probably figure it out. But if you have a person coming to you on a horse and they carry a copyright notice, good luck detecting them. Another example here is if you put a simple fur coat on a Chihuahua, then they disappear because all you see is a feather boa. You don't see the dog, basic camouflage. And that's tongue-in-cheek, obviously. But even more to the point, if you took an image like this from history, which is a very important image, and you say, do you see black or white people in this? It's actually, again, the wrong question, because what you're seeing is an inability to recognize the true threat, which is white supremacy or white insecurity. And so, and you see that a lot actually in the news. The AI systems are not being trained and not being used to see that there's a lot of people who are very dangerous threats that are in our midst. In fact, when you look at things that AI is not doing, right? So they're not looking at, the algorithms are not looking at evidence of white supremacists. They're not looking at evidence of people using things like the white ethno-state of Rhodesia as a signal to each other to organize. Hands up, a good example of this, used to mean in 1979, a white ethno-state. It was, you put your hands up. If you don't, we shoot you. Right. And that's basically the way they rolled. They would disguise themselves as blacks, and then they go around shooting blacks and just saying hands up. People were very confused, and they would shoot them based on the reaction. But that all changed in 2021. The same people were doing the same things in the same area of the world, and suddenly they're accused of war crimes. Now, I point that out because the next thing that happens is we talk about how AI is learning from the past in order to figure out what it should be doing in the future. And so books like Hands Up, Don't Shoot kind of lay this out. But if you look at unlawful and biased police practices and the data that's training them, you see it's learning from very bad practices in the past. And the idea of this Hands Up, Don't Shoot model in the past can lead to serious war crimes, serious problems. And if AI learns from them, it's going to make the same mistakes. And so completely false claims, in the last point on this I want to make basically before we sort of close out this section, is people can actually claim that they have AI when they don't. And all they're really doing is perpetuating bias. All they're doing is trying to perpetuate a sort of power imbalance. And none of the stuff in the Banjo company was making, none of the stuff that they were claiming was actually true. They were just trying to get some money in order to build systems. And the person had obvious former neo-Nazi connections. Another one, just before we go, is antivirus bias, where people can actually make a simple change, as I was doing earlier. But now you're trying to detect real threats and it's real situation. So malware was able to slip through by trying to look like just basically anything else, a simple game. And another example I just threw in here was you have people trying to cry wolf. Well, if you're detecting wolves by looking at snow, you're going to have a very broken threat detection algorithm. It's a famous case, so I thought I'd add it in here. But anyway, let's close this out. As I said, the last example, number 7. So the top of the food chart here in terms of, or the worst case, for example, in terms of breaches, I believe to be transit safety. And I've talked about this a lot in the past. I've given a lot of presentations where I basically say, hey, if you can't see what's going on, if you claim to be 90% effective and I can throw some tests at you and you're completely stopped, then that's a fail. And if a pedestrian jumps out in front of you, easy to test. If we throw up a Mylar balloon in the middle of the street and you run it over, that's a fail. You're not allowed to drive anymore. You shouldn't be allowed to be on the road. But in fact, you see over time, 2016, 2017, multiple tests have shown that these cars cannot see. They can't see signs. They can't see objects. They're easily gamed, easily fooled. And it's not just the tests. They're not just talking about academics. We see in tweets and evidence in the news that people are having problems with their machines that are supposedly in production. You can put a sign on the back of a bus, and I mean, you can put a sign on the back of anything, really, a car, and the car behind you will read that as a street sign. That's ridiculous. You can see that the amount of confusion that a Tesla has between signs is unacceptable. You would not be able to drive if you had this kind of problem as a human. More to the point, humans are being tested more and more than ever to prove that they actually are who they say they are, whereas these machines can't even see a flashing lights on a police car and big letters that say, don't crash into me, right? Who gets to keep driving? And there's a big difference in reactions, when we have failings in AI too. And Uber failed to see red lights and pedestrians that said, hey, fine, we'll go to Arizona, where they ended up killing a pedestrian very predictably. I told people that was what's going to happen. I think a lot of people did, and that's exactly what happened. So 2018, Tesla killed a pedestrian, and they had a very different response than Uber. They basically said, hey, we're going to shut down our PR department. We're going to stop returning calls, and we're going to start upselling this technology as an even more expensive one. And so I guess you could say predictably, Tesla over time has made the same mistake over and over again. What's interesting, though, is they've replaced a lot of technology. So they got rid of the Mobileye. They had a falling out with that company. They went with NVIDIA. They had another accident. Now they have another accident. So they keep having the same accident, even though they change all of the technology, which brings it back to, it's not really, the algorithm. It's not really the people writing the algorithm. It's the world that the people come from who are writing the algorithm, and what assumptions are they making, and what safety are they putting into the system, right? So are they actually trending worse over time? And it's not just me saying this, I'm not trying to be provocative here. When you look at the NVIDIA folks themselves who put the technology in the car, when they talk about the leaders in the transit safety industry, they don't put Tesla at the top of the chart. They're way down at the bottom, and everybody else is at the top of the chart. Tesla's the laggard. They're way behind everybody in terms of safety. So that's what we see in the AI systems, the tests that are being done in the real world that could cause accidents and can kill people. They can't see the double yellow lines. They're driving on the wrong side of the road. They're having near collisions. They are blind in basic tests. People go out on the road to see if this amazing stuff is working, and it's not. The AI is completely failing. What's seen from the air and what's seen from the car is completely different in terms of cars that are going to run into you. In this case in particular, there was a car that the AI tried to launch into and would have killed or damaged the people a couple times. And so it's easily documented how flawed it is. Really shouldn't even be on the road at this point when you think about what this is doing. And so here's an example of what happens next is, Tesla plows into people and kills people. So it's a really sad outcome for basically what we're doing. When you talk about this going into this kind of trust being put into technology and all the breaches that we've talked about so far, it's going to set us back if we don't do proper testing and basically put this into a mode where you can respond rationally when people have a flaw or a breach and say, this is what happened and this is what we're doing to fix it. But in fact, what you find with Tesla is the opposite. They've had a major breach, major catastrophe, and the response is incomprehensible. The car itself is being designed to drive without a human in it. There's nobody in the car, and so it's called summoning the car. And when it starts to get summoned, it tries to run over somebody, and Tesla's response is, well, the person in the car could obviously take back control. That doesn't work. And so what you see instead is claims made that it's the safest record of any car based on no records at all. You see claims made against the NHTSA, which don't seem to map to anything in reality. In the last 3 quarters, you see Tesla AI having massive problems in the news. You may have heard about people dying and testing the car and ended up in a fire and dead. And you also see that there's a rapid decline in the ability of the car to actually be safe. So other cars, we're not seeing that. And we're actually seeing other brands have much more safety, more perfect safety records than ever, as Tesla seems to be getting worse and worse, and all of this overconfidence. And so what does that really mean? To sort of wrap it up, you've got these breaches, you've got all these problems, you've got all these risks. Again, I would say to apply this, you need to go back to the basics, which is, do you have an off button? Do you have a reset button? You don't just tell me that there's a person in the car when there's no person in the car. That's not an acceptable off button. A reset button, did it try to run somebody over? Well, then you need to go back to the basics and say, don't try to run people over, learn differently, or reset it to go back to before where you thought that was acceptable, because that's obviously a wrong outcome. And the strategic is back to, are you threat modeling so you don't end up in that situation? Don't be designing AI for a treeless moonscape where there's perfect light from the sun when you then put it into a forest and expect the car to navigate instead of running into a tree. That's just not the way threat modeling works for AI. And so set up an ethics review board to make sure that these are things that are being considered. You're thinking through the process so that you can gate things before they get released to production. People should not be human guinea pigs. People should not be harmed. They shouldn't be told they're a she when they're a he. They shouldn't be told to kill themselves when they have a particular sexual preference. They shouldn't be bullied. They shouldn't be harmed, right? All these things come from understanding the social context under which AI is being developed, and how people who are developing it carry with them a sense of power, a sense of right and wrong, a sense of up and down. And so ultimately, again, assign executive level enforcement so that you have some independent way of holding people responsible. Consequences is key. And so what you find in companies like Facebook and Amazon, they don't seem to have any sense of consequence or responsibility. And so they continuously harm people using these technologies. And that's why things are getting worse. So back to the point 3.7 or 1.7, we definitely want to be collaborating more. We definitely want to be using the 1.7, the Einsteins. It may take us 500 years, but I think we can get there faster if we stop trying to be so competitive and try to get rid of the situation where people are bringing in the Tatra 87 and just trying to drive as fast as possible to prove that you can kill yourself. It's not a good way to handle the new technology. Let's try to work better at making things safer. And thank you.